Good afternoon. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the University of Toronto. On behalf of the board and staff of IMFG, the Institute for Management and Innovation at UTM, and the Master of Urban Innovation program, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's talk on how has the pandemic impacted global cities, evidence from London, Paris, and Toronto, with our guest speaker, Mark Kleinman. Today's event is hybrid. This is the first one we've done as a hybrid event. That means we have a very small audience, but a great audience here in the room with us, and a lot of people on Zoom. So let me welcome those of you who are here and everyone joining us online. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank our co-sponsors for today for all the help they've given us in putting this event together. I'd also like to thank the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maitree, the Neptus Foundation, the City of Toronto, the Region of Halton, and the Region of York. Thanks also to Thomas and Piali at IMFG and Adam and Derry at the Monk School for their help in organizing this event and making it run smoothly, and I know it's going to run smoothly. If you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. We are really pleased to have Mark Kleinman back at the University of Toronto. As many of you know, Mark spent some time here as a visiting fellow in 2015 and published an excellent paper on cities, data, and innovation, which I think was at the front desk when you came in. For those of you online, it's on our website. Today, he's going to present some of his research on the COVID-19 crisis, and I know you're going to appreciate his insights on the impact of the pandemic on global cities. So welcome, Mark. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Shauna Braille. Shauna is an associate professor at the Institute for Management and Innovation at the U of T and a senior associate at the Innovation Policy Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She's an economic geographer and urban planner. Her research focuses on the transformation of cities as a result of economic, social, and cultural change. And she's done a lot of work recently on the impact of COVID-19 on cities, and I hope she'll have a chance to share some of that with you as well. So this is what we're going to do. Shauna is going to introduce Mark. Mark will speak for about 40 minutes. After that, Shauna and Mark will both sit up here and engage in a brief discussion, followed by a Q&A with the audience. We will take some questions from here in the room and some from the online audience. So for those of you who are online, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to send in your questions. You can do that at any time throughout the talk. We will get to as many as we can in the time we have. So over to Shauna.
Oh, I get the stool also. Thank you, Enid, and the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, as well as our co-sponsors from the Institute for Management and Innovation and the Master of Urban Innovation program. It is a real pleasure to be here today in person for this discussion. More than 2 years ago, urban life around the world was dramatically disrupted because of the spread of COVID-19 and associated public health measures deployed to, among other things, save lives and manage healthcare system capacity. In Toronto, as many of you know, we have experienced great challenges. Today, downtown office workers comprise between 20 to 30% of pre-pandemic numbers of in-person workers, and transit ridership remains at about 50% of pre-pandemic levels. The economic burdens of COVID-19 are also unequal. Female unemployment rates in Toronto remain elevated, and there is evidence to suggest that racialized employees have fared worse in the labor market than others. And no matter how much we wish it to be the case, the pandemic is not yet over. However, cities and their policy responses to COVID-19 alongside other evidence of recovery, present a source of hope. Deep questions still remain about the prospects for global cities like London and Toronto, including the one that Professor Kleinman poses in the title of his talk this afternoon. How has the pandemic impacted the economic role of global cities? I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker, Professor Mark Kleinman. Though I just met Mark this afternoon for the first time in real life, we have been research collaborators for some time, with thanks to Zoom, and a shared interest in understanding whether and how cities might recover from the impacts of COVID-19. Mark is Professor of Public Policy at King's College London. He has worked as a consultant to public and private sector organizations, including the OECD, the European Commission, and major UK and global companies. Furthermore, he was an advisor at the No. 10 Strategy Unit, a civil servant at the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, and a policy director for all 3 London mayors. Mark is the author or co-author of 4 books and more than 100 papers. Since 2020, Mark has been studying the impacts of COVID-19 on the economic role of global cities and the leading urban policy issues to be addressed. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kleinman.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Shauna and Enid. And thanks also to all my friends in Toronto who I've known over the years. And this is my, I don't know what visit to the city, and I always enjoy coming here. It's great to be able to come here for my first trip outside London in 2 years. What I want to talk about today is the impact that COVID is having on global cities like London and Toronto and Paris and many others. And like many people in the room, when the pandemic first hit and government began to respond to that, as someone who spent a large part of his working life right in the centre of a global city, because King's College London is right in the middle of the central area, as the UFT St George's campus is here, it was an issue which was of more than just academic concern to me. Now, to recap very briefly, we've got used to the idea that being in a global city, being a firm in a global city, being a global city government is a good thing. By the second decade of the 21st century, more than half of the world's population was already living in cities. And within that group of cities, there was an elite group, a subgroup, which had thrived over the last 30 years as keynodes of the global economy, attractors of talent, investment, and ideas in an ever more connected system. Almost overnight, with the onset of COVID-19, many of the very benefits of large global cities, crowds, proximity, connectivity, openness, have also become vulnerabilities. And a number of urban scholars responded very quickly to this new challenge. And many of these early takes were, if not pessimistic, at least concerned. So Joel Kotkin pointed out, pandemics have always been bad for dense urban areas. Global and vital also means more susceptible, he argued, in a pattern that stretches from Rome and Alexandria in antiquity to London and Paris more recently. And he argued, at least at this stage, that homeworking and dispersing perhaps could offer opportunities of creating a locally based, more humane and sustainable urban culture as an alternative to ever more density. Ed Glaser, the author of Triumph of the City, and a much more consistent advocate of the benefits of density and proximity, nevertheless pointed out that in Shakespeare's London, life expectancy was 6 years lower than in the rest of England. While he declared himself optimistic about the ability of elected governments to tackle public health crises, he nevertheless said, let's not ignore the fact that the pandemic is an existential threat to high-density living based around face-to-face contact. So my response to this was, yes, but. And why but? First of all, I didn't see any evidence that we'd got it wrong on the importance of agglomeration economies, that we'd somehow miscalculated this, or that they were going to operate in a substantially different way. I also read a few pieces by economic historians or historians of the city, which brought out very clearly that cities adapt, they decline sometimes, but mostly they grow. And that very success, of course, brings inequalities, which I'll talk about a bit later. So my overall reading of this was pandemics have certainly impacted and affected cities, but there seems very little evidence that they had fundamentally changed the direction of economic growth. In the city with which I'm most familiar, after World War II, London's manufacturing and goods handling base dwindled to a fraction of its former self. But London was reborn as a city of services, financial, business, educational, but also creative, cultural, and more recently, scientific and technological, and more. So my reading of that was that London and other global cities are unlikely to disappear. But at the same time, it would be naive to think this is a blip, there'll be a pandemic, everything will go back to what it used to be. They're likely to become different places and perhaps even more unequal. Now, I'm going to talk in a moment about the economic impact, but before doing so, I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at public attitudes, because this is an area which, until recently, I'd spent very little time examining, but through a couple of research projects that I've been involved in, I've been able to see how attitudes in at least two cities have altered, or rather not altered, over the period of the pandemic. So at King's, we formed a partnership with the Université de Paris in 2019, and we were able, I hesitate to use the word fortuitous about something as awful as a global pandemic, but there was at least serendipity in that we decided in around autumn 2019 that one thing we could do as part of our partnership, joining with Ipsos Mori, the polling organisation, was to carry out a survey of citizen attitudes in London and Paris in terms of how they felt about living in a large city. Now, of course, when we carried this out in November and early December 2019, we had no idea that a global pandemic was about to strike. But we ended up, through this process of serendipity, with effectively a baseline of attitudes in these two cities on the very eve of the pandemic. So we then resurveyed in both cities around May, June 2021, so about 18 months later, and we were therefore able to compare. And this has led to a very large database because we asked a lot of questions. And I just want to pull out 3 or 4 of the key points which I think are most relevant to our topic today. First of all, we found that the death of the city narrative was at the very least very exaggerated. So we had a standard question: how likely, if at all, is it that you will move out of London or move out of Paris in the next 5 years? Now, you get a fairly high proportion of people who at least declare their intention to move out. There's nothing particularly surprising about this. It's part of the well-attested life cycle of people often moving out, say at the family building stage, in search of more space, better amenities, cheaper housing, and so on. But what we did find was this didn't seem to change very much between 2019 and 2021. So in London, about 29% in 2019 said they were very or fairly likely. That went up a bit to 36% in 2021, but not a huge increase. And in Paris, it barely budged, about 32, 33% in both cases. So first of all, at least at the level of a visceral response, people didn't seem to be giving up on the city in large numbers. Secondly, we found that satisfaction with their local area, so a standard question on how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your local neighbourhood, we found that satisfaction with local area was undented, despite the fact that, of course, by 2021, people had experienced long periods of lockdown and spending much more time than previously at home. And going a bit further, we found that satisfaction with local services in both cities had actually increased between 2019 and 2021. Now, we can speculate, although we didn't probe, why is this? Is it because people were spending more time at home and were more appreciative of local services? Is it because local governments were better at communicating with their residents because of the need to promote public health measures? Those would be interesting questions to look at. We can't answer that from this data, but it's certainly the case that expressed satisfaction with services increased over this period. Also, and very importantly for our topic today, clear majorities in both capitals thought that their city would recover from COVID, albeit slowly. So the numbers saying we don't think it's ever going to happen was about 1 in 6 in Paris and more like 1 in 10 in London. The majority of people thought this would be a fairly slow process, with a minority thinking it could happen very quickly. So I think that's an important baseline or backdrop in terms of how people feel about the city before we come on to look at what the actual economic impacts have been. I'd also like to throw in a couple of more recent findings. I think I've lost this diagram, unfortunately, but not to worry, I'll describe it for you. A very recent survey, beginning of this month, there are local elections coming up in London in May. These are borough elections, so the lower tier authorities. And the London Communications Agency asked a representative sample, what do you think are most important issues? The top issue, by a long, long way, was cost of living pressures. And this is a major issue in the UK, as some of you may be aware of. Second was that old favourite, housing affordability. The pandemic was halfway down. If you could see the slide, there's about 12 different possibilities. The pandemic is halfway down. Only about 15% of people referred to it. So it seems to be dropping down the political saliency agenda pretty rapidly. This chart, which you can see, this is national data, so not for London, but it's national data. Resolution Foundation. Now, there's some good news and some bad news here. The red line, the good news, people's anxiety about COVID, which you can see peaks in the sort of first quarter 2021, falls pretty rapidly through 21 and 22. There's a little blip when we had the Omicron wave, January of this year, but it's basically on a downward trajectory. The slightly depressing news, although for any philosophers tuning into this or in the room, this probably comes as no surprise. People are less anxious about COVID, but they're not less anxious full stop. So we seem to have some kind of regular level of anxiety, which we like. So the bottom line, adults reporting high levels of anxiety doesn't really change. But we've now got other things to worry about than COVID. We can go back to worrying about house prices and rents, or we can worry about utility bills, which is a major factor in the cost of living issue we have in the UK. So I think the overall pattern there is, first of all, COVID didn't have perhaps quite the effects even at the time, which a lot of commentators might have expected. And it does seem to be rapidly dropping down both the anxiety scale and the political saliency scale. Now, with that as a backdrop, let's look at some of the specific economic impacts. And I want to very quickly look at some of the general information and then zoom in a bit on, mainly on London, but also on Toronto. So the early evidence, Florida and Kotkin writing together said the pandemic is possibly the most geographically transformative event in the US since the great post-war migration. And that was coming on the back of a certain amount of evidence, demographic evidence, certainly in the US, of larger cities struggling a bit and medium-sized cities and small towns doing rather better in the most recent period compared with the previous decade. In terms of more widespread studies, this article, which I've referenced here, Rodriguez, Posey and Berliner, they looked at 206 regions across 23 European countries in the first half of 2020. So again, just caveating, I think this is true of all the evidence, you know, there have been successive waves and phases of the pandemic, so one needs to be a bit careful in interpreting data from particular phases. So this is very early, first half of 2020. Nevertheless, and this was really a bit of a surprise to me, excess deaths were concentrated in a relatively small number of regions. More than 40% of these 200 or so regions experienced no excess mortality over that period, while only 16 regions had excess deaths of 20% or more. So the most extreme impacts were concentrated in a relatively small number of regions. Both highly connected regions and those with colder and drier geographies with high air pollution, not surprisingly, and relatively poor healthcare systems had the highest mortality. Some of that is not surprising. What was more surprising to me was these authors found that it was road connectivity and not air connectivity which was more significant. They also found that institutions, both formal institutions, that is, levels of government, and informal institutions played a role. Just to look at a few other studies, the McCann study, which covers a slightly longer period, March to November, so most of 2020, a multi-level model combining national, regional, and local data, they found that urban density itself is not necessarily a facilitator of transmission, although they caveated that a little by saying our understanding of this is still limited. They also found a role for institutional and governance factors, and they found no relationship with regional income, which is in contrast with the next study I've listed here, Antonietti et al. They looked at 138 countries, so note these are countries, they're not regions and they're not cities, in the early phase of the pandemic, and this is very early, this is March and April only. They found that infection and mortality was higher in countries with higher GDP per capita, and they found the GDP per capita effect is much more significant than their air quality variable. Although I think air quality at a national level is a bit of a stretch. I think that needs to be not even at the city level, but probably at the neighborhood or even sub-neighborhood level. But nevertheless, higher GDP per capita, both infection and mortality were raised. And closer to home for me, Max Nathan's paper in 2021, he found, similarly with McCann, that theories which emphasize city size and international connectivity are relatively less effective at explaining differences in transmission rates. Theories which highlight urban housing markets, urban labor markets, and deprivation, as well as related differences in behavioral responses, were better aligned with the evidence. In other words, it's not so much living and working in a global city, it's where you live. Do you live in overcrowded housing? Do you work in a people-facing job where you can't work from home, you have to go to the workplace, and you necessarily come into contact with large numbers of people? Nathan also shows, because the data covers more than one wave, that while wave one spread from London, which, if you like, supports the sort of global city, and then it fans out from there, but the second and third waves in England started elsewhere, and he also finds there was substantial divergence within the big urban areas, both within London and the other major cities. So if we go on to look a little more specifically at London, firstly, just to recap, and I know this will be familiar to a lot of people in the room and online, but I think it's worth mentioning. When we talk, we've had 30 years of growth, nearly 40 years of growth in London, and it's quite easy to slip into thinking London has always been a growth story. In fact, for most of the 20th century, London declined in both economic and population terms. And that was partly driven by economic fundamentals, but it was accelerated by deliberate public policy. moving both people and jobs out of London, either to new towns and garden cities or to other regions. London's population decline accelerated through the 50s and 60s and peaked in the 1970s, when the net loss was about 750,000 people. So 10% of the city's population was lost in the 1970s. This slowed and then reversed in the 1980s. And an important point here, I would argue, we still don't really know why that happened. We accept it, and we can point at a number of likely suspects for that inflection point. The UK joining the EU, the completion of the single market, the importance of financial services, increased globalization, etc. But we don't really have a consistent theory of why that inflection point happened and why it was such a strong inflection point. And I think if we don't have a theory of urban growth in this particular global city, then it's difficult really to assess the evidence about potential decline or an inflection point in another direction. But it did reverse, and London essentially made a successful transition from a manufacturing to a service-based economy. It was able to thrive in this new era, not the first era of globalization, but in this new era of globalization, it could thrive. At the same time, the spatial pattern didn't change very much. So the majority of jobs in London are concentrated in what we call the central activity zone. So that is the expanded CBD. For those of you who know London, that's the West End, the City of London, the Isle of Dogs, that is Canary Wharf, and what we used to think of as city fringe areas like King's Cross and Paddington, which are rapidly becoming or have become part of that central CBD. You get some clustering out to the west associated with Heathrow Airport, and a little bit of clustering in the south, which is possibly associated with Gatwick, but it's a very CBD-oriented economy, at least in terms of jobs. Now, in terms of what's happened with employment as one indicator, you can see from this chart, and this is going through to the third quarter in 2021, it's very much a V-shaped recovery. So the blue line is the UK and the red line is London. Both fall off a cliff with the beginning of the pandemic and the introduction of various non-pharmaceutical initiatives. London falls faster, as you can see. The depth of the recession, at least in terms of measuring it in terms of jobs, is steeper. It turns round slightly later than the UK as a whole, but with each succeeding month, that recovery in terms of jobs gets stronger. And as you can see, we'll have to wait for further detail. It looks like the rate of growth in jobs in the UK is probably in London is probably going to outpace the UK as a whole. We get a similar, although slower pattern if we look at transport data. So here we're looking at passenger journeys on the London system. The red line is bus usage, the blue line is tube usage. Falls off a cliff at the beginning. Since then, a fairly consistent underlying trend of recovery, although there are cycles around that associated with different waves of the pandemic and the relaxation or the reintroduction of lockdown measures. But you can see the direction of travel pretty clearly. On the far right-hand side, the most recent data, you've got the Omicron effect, but I would expect that to turn back fairly quickly. But it's still well below the level that we had pre-pandemic. So use of public transport is recovering, but it is recovering relatively slowly compared with the recovery in jobs and the recovery in economic activity more generally. And again, on business sentiment, so this is the regular PMI survey of business activity. This has remained positive for the last 12 months. So again, you get a fall off, you get a very rapid recovery notice in sentiment. That comes back very quickly. And since then, there's a bit of a cyclical pattern, but it's a pretty strong recovery in business sentiment for private firms in London. Now, what all that means is, in terms of economic projections, and here I'm using the projections, which are produced regularly by my former colleagues at City Hall in the GLA economics team. I know they do benchmark their projections against other economic forecasters, so I don't think this is very different from what other economic forecasters would show. So on the top half of the graph, the recovery in terms of output is pretty well established. And you've got some scenarios in there, but they're all in a positive direction and going above the line of the pre-pandemic level of activity fairly quickly. In the second half of the diagram, in the lower half of the diagram, the shape of the jobs recovery is similar, but it's slower. So we don't expect the number of jobs to come back until 2023, possibly later. But again, the direction of travel is fairly clear. Does this mean everything is back to normal? Well, maybe not. So here, this map is based on retail spending, or rather card spending in retail, and this is using MasterCard data, which I think is used in Toronto as well as in other cities. It's not open data, unfortunately, but our public authorities have access to it, and they produce these kind of maps. And you can see here that by July 2021, retail spending, at least on this measure, is back to, or in some cases actually above, pre-pandemic levels in most of outer London. It's not in the central boroughs, so this is reflecting two main drivers. One is the loss of commuters from the central area, but secondly, and almost certainly more importantly, the loss of international tourists, both business tourists and leisure tourists. You can also see out to the west, the recovery is not so strong on the outer edges of West London, which is rather surprising, well, would be surprising, but there's obviously an airport-related effect there, not just in terms of passengers, but of course all those services which support a major airport hub. So this raises again the question of, has London peaked? And I wrote an article more than 2 years ago with that title, with I think a question mark in it, have we peaked? Because even pre-COVID, there were some signs of slowing down. In the year to mid-2017, London's population experienced the slowest rate of growth in over a decade, at only 0.6%. International migration declined to a net gain of only 83,000 in 16-17, although that was still the largest contributor, international migration, to demographic growth in the capital. Brexit and COVID complicate the picture. So we've had quite a lot of debate and discussion about really just trying to work out how many people there actually are in London. Because what we found was that many of the traditional data sources couldn't really cope, struggled even with the impact of Brexit, are European nationals leaving, staying, and so on. But certainly with COVID, which interrupted some of the regular data collection, the reliability of the numbers became much more difficult. So it becomes more difficult to interpret. Nevertheless, and here again I'm relying on my GLA colleagues, who I think have done a lot of thoughtful work on this. Their latest update from February, so just last month, deaths, not surprisingly, mainly in the over 75s, have increased due to COVID. Births have continued on their long-term downward trend. There's been no change in fertility rates per se. Overall, natural change is the lowest since the 2000s. Many young adults left London during or immediately after the first lockdown, but many returned in spring and summer 2021. So again, there was a lot of media attention on this. Oh, young people are leaving the city, they don't want to live here anymore. Well, if you can't go to work and you can't go to the gym and you can't go out and meet your friends, there's not a lot of reason for staying in the city. And if people have options of going somewhere else, perhaps back to the parental home for a while, many young people took this up, but they began to return even by spring, summer 2021. International migration, of course, fell due to COVID, plus also some Brexit effect, although it's difficult to disentangle it. non-visitor flows at least partially recovered in the months to September 21. So their overall conclusion, the City Intelligence team, is that in the first year of the pandemic, London's population is likely to have fallen for the first time in 3 decades. But since spring 2021, it's likely that the population has resumed growing, although at a slower rate than pre-pandemic. I don't want to get too diverted onto policy and investment, but we can pick it up in the Q&A. But I think it's important just to have a couple of minutes on what that implies, both for investment in the city and the policy towards the city over the next 20 or 30 years. So in the next few weeks, Transport for London and the Mayor are slightly coy about the exact date, but in the next few weeks, Crossrail 1, or the Elizabeth line as it will be called, will open. So this is a huge piece of investment. This is £18 billion worth of new transit. This is slashing the journey times between key stations in the centre, journey times to the airport, journey times to Canary Wharf. These are not tube trains. These are trains about twice the size, 1,500 people per train, travelling every 2.5 minutes through the central London stations. A 10% increase in the total capacity of the London Underground network. That's been about 30 years in the making altogether, like most major transit investments. What is going to happen next? When I worked at City Hall, there was a lot of discussion about Crossrail 2. There was a lot of discussion about the Bakerloo line extension to southeast London, the latter of which was seen as close to being a done deal. At the moment, everything is paused. And other kind of major projects, perhaps not on the same scale as that, are nevertheless paused. But as we know, if you want to keep your city growing and you want to anticipate the increase in population and in economic activity, you have to start planning now for the numbers which are 1, 2, 3 decades out. And at the moment, we're rather paused on that. And in a similar way, while I painted quite a positive picture of the London economy and indeed the London population, what I haven't talked about so far are the inequalities which can both continue and possibly deepen as a result of COVID-19. So although unemployment in London is falling, and it's falling quite strongly, it's still above the UK average. So there is still, and this has historically been the case, that employment rates in London have been lower than in most other parts of the UK. So that problem hasn't gone away. When we start breaking down the sectoral change in jobs, and I've recently seen data for Toronto, which Shauna shared with me, it looks very similar, sort of diagram to this. So we're seeing there are key sectors which are growing rapidly: administration, health and social work, professional services, whereas other sectors, particularly the people-facing, arts, entertainment and recreation, hospitality and so on, have really been hit very hard. Now, these may come back as the economy generally recovers, but I think we can't assume that they're going to come back. And comparing the blue and red lines in the diagram, London has been overrepresented in the hit to these sectors because the relative size of, say, the hospitality or the cultural sector is much larger in London than elsewhere. Also, we've seen very directly unequal COVID-19 impacts. And I know this is the case in Toronto too. It's, I'm sure, the case in most comparable large cities. So infections have not been evenly spread across London's population. So these data are for July 2020 to March 21. The rate of positive tests was a third higher in the most deprived 20% of London neighbourhoods compared with the least deprived 20% of neighbourhoods. And so infection, you'd get similar patterns for hospitalisation and indeed for deaths. And the Trust for London, which publishes a regular poverty profile for London, points out that poor Londoners have been impacted in a variety of other ways. An increase in the use of food banks, in the city an increase in the number of people claiming benefits, even with the special measures that were brought in to support incomes of workers who could no longer work at their place of work, and the impact on mental health and on various other social indicators. So we know that the impact, both in medical terms, in economic terms, and in wider social and health terms, has not been equal across the population. Is that going to widen and or worsen the already existing inequalities in cities like London and indeed Toronto? That all suggests that there's an important policy agenda for addressing poverty and inequality within London. Unfortunately, the national rhetoric, the rhetoric from the national government, continues to focus mainly on inter-region differences. And the narrative that comes out of this, fairly crudely, is London will be all right, it can look after itself. We are going to focus on other parts of the country, and this is what is referred to nowadays as the levelling up agenda. And of course, that is based on a certain amount of macro evidence. So in the two charts here, on the left-hand side, London is the red bar at the bottom. This is productivity in terms of GVA per workforce job. Productivity in London is much higher than every other region in the UK. And in the bar chart on the right, this is looking at cumulative economic growth by UK region and by the separate countries of the UK in the 6 years after the global financial crisis. So even though it was a financial crisis, London came out of it stronger and recovered more quickly, that's the bar on the left-hand side, than all the other regions in the UK, and considerably so, more so than the lagging regions to the right. So we have a policy debate which is mainly about levelling up between London and the rest of the country. Fair enough, that's an important issue, but it shouldn't be used to mask the very important inequality issues within London. Okay, so I'd like to spend the last part of my talk before wrapping up with some policy suggestions, or or at least a suggested policy agenda, by just looking a little bit at economic impact and economic recovery in Toronto. And this is very much based on the work which Shauna and I have been doing over the last year or so. So our first finding, it's not clear when true economic recovery in this city will actually be underway. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence yet of permanent large-scale decline in either economic activity or population. And it's likely that Toronto's economic success as a second-tier global city will continue. And just to be clear, we're not using second-tier in a pejorative sense. We think it's an interesting positioning that Toronto has, and there are other cities like Sydney, for example, not trying to compete with London, Paris, Hong Kong, etc., but actually making use of the competitive assets to drive your position in the next level just below that. So we see that as continuing. However, the pandemic exposed and exacerbated many of the sorts of inequalities which I've touched on in the description of London. And our thinking is that pandemic preparedness and perhaps resilience in general will figure more strongly in assessments of global cities' competitive positions. So if you go right back, city competitiveness used to be about almost entirely hard economic data, number of jobs, level of investment, and so on. Then we began to include issues like quality of life, air quality, and so on. So it's reasonable to think that in future assessments, pandemic preparedness specifically, but perhaps resilience more generally, will begin to figure more strongly. So in other words, we see pandemic resilience as one of a number of factors that influence the success of global cities in general, but thinking in terms of second-tier cities and Toronto's peers, will influence that debate rather than a sort of once and for all game changer, which is going to change the whole way we think about global cities. Now, when you come right down to Toronto, and this is why I keep coming back here, or one of the reasons, because I think it's really fascinating how Toronto positions itself and presents itself. And there are two ways of looking at this. You could look at it in terms of strategic positioning. You could also be more critical and say it's about lack of ambition. I think both Sean and I tend to the first one. But anyway, let's give airtime to the lack of ambition. So if you look at the opportunities which have come up over the last few years, so the election of Trump in the USA, making it much more difficult for talent to move to the US, a huge competitive advantage for Canada. The Amazon HQ competition, the whole Sidewalk Labs saga, those have all been partly exploited, but only partly. Now, again, I think you can put this two ways. One, you could put it in terms of there's a lack of ambition of Toronto really grasping the opportunity. I think just as, or probably more important, is think about strategic positioning. So I think the response to Amazon HQ and also to Sidewalk Labs, although I'm treading very carefully on eggshells about that one, but I think the Amazon one is a more straightforward story. Yes, we'd like you to come here. We'd like you to come here because this is a tech center. We have the skills, we have the infrastructure, we have the institutions which will make your investment a success. Not, we're prepared to give you X million more in tax breaks than 50 other cities across North America. So that was I think that was a really important point. That was a really important moment in understanding Toronto's competitive offer. Sidewalk is a more complicated story, as I understand it, but at the very least, it certainly put Toronto on a number of institutions and investors' radars where it wasn't there before. Now, that's about the city as a whole. As I've touched on in this presentation, it is possible that there'll be some redistribution of economic activity across the wider city region. And I showed you in London, it's still a very centralised story in terms of job. It may be, conjecture, connected and flexible megacity regions might be a way of combining the benefits of centrality and agglomeration on the one hand with greater demand for space both from certain firms and from households. In other words, thinking about a variety of growth poles and, of course, the work from Toronto Region Board of Trade and the Economic Blueprint Institute and others, identifying there isn't just one growth pole in the CBD, there's 5 which can be identified. Now, if that way of looking at things is correct, this is going to pose some specific challenges for Toronto and the region, and I'd say for just about every other global city, in terms of the governance arrangements and, or to put it another way, the scope for better coordination between different levels of government and different types of institutions. And that's not specific to Toronto, but there is a specific institutional history and framework which will need to be addressed. So, finally, and I'm just throwing these out as policy issues rather than discussing them in any great detail, I think we can identify at least 7 key policy issues for cities. The first one, I think this is an interesting story because certainly in the UK, this was around quite a lot in the early stages and then seemed to disappear for some reason. In other words, is it health and the economy together or is it health versus the economy? Is it a choice between public health measures to protect the population and measures to get the economy back to work and to get people back into CBDs as quickly as possible? And I think there was quite an interesting debate emerging about whether it is either or whether the two go together. That seems to have gone away a bit, but I think it's important that it comes back. Secondly, we saw 2 very contradictory trends through the time period of the pandemic in terms of mobility. First, we saw a reclaiming of road space for other uses, whether this was putting in bike lanes so that people could get around, or it was allowing restaurants to have more outdoor space, more patio space, so that they could continue to function even though they couldn't have any or a restricted number of people indoors. At the same time, people got back in their cars because of a justified or unjustified fear of being in public transit. So those two things can't continue at the same time, and I think we're looking at issues over road space, the use of public space, road pricing, and so on. Thirdly, as I've touched on, economic transition. There looks to be some sectoral change going on. How does that impact? Well, first of all, how much of that is real? We'll need a few years to see, but what's the impact on land use and the geography of the city more generally? Fourthly, hybrid working. How significant is it and what will its impacts be? And we're involved in work in London on this, looking at the return to the office or the not return to the office, and what the medium and long term of that is going to look like, and how will it impact on the city generally. Related to that, but worth a discussion on its own, the future of CBDs and downtowns more generally, and as I've touched on, perhaps we're going to have less monocentricity in the future. 6, tackling inequalities, both existing inequalities and perhaps new ones, or rather perhaps existing ones which have been exposed more by the pandemic. And finally, the last point I made in the main presentation, devolution of powers, funding, and governance. We've had a real-world experience of how do you deliver services, both public health and economic recovery measures, with various levels of government being involved. What has that shown us about the appropriate division of powers between levels of government and division of funding responsibilities and fiscal capacity? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I'll wait for you to sit down before I start badgering you with questions.
Okay, that's fine. Badger away.
Well, first of all, thank you for a really compelling presentation on global cities and the role of agglomeration, and the question about how economically significant will these global cities remain post-COVID. You touched on issues around decline and rebound, around the death of the city narrative. Thank you for that. Around inequalities, both locally and regionally, nationally as well, and on some comparison with Toronto, which actually is incredibly interesting to see so many of those similarities around return to the CBD and lack of return to the CBD and lack of return to transit in particular. I know that we have a super engaged audience, and so I'm going to start with a few questions, and then I'm going to open it up. I apologize in advance if I ask your question. But my first question, Mark, is, you touched on some of the big areas of disruption, downtown core, transit, distinction between remote and non-remote workers. What kinds of adaptations, whether policy or infrastructure investments or otherwise, could best help to smoothen disruption as cities adjust to the reality of a pandemic that's still here?
Yep, that's a very good and quite difficult question. So let's deal with sort of return to work and different work patterns and so on. I don't see this settling down to a new normal anytime soon. And I say that for a variety of reasons. One is because I think there's a whole range of behavioural responses, and we've seen there are important differences across sectors. And also from my own personal point of view, and I'm sure we've all been through this, it's like, what do I actually want to do? So we've had this forced experience from working from home. It actually worked better than we thought, but it had a number of disadvantages. What do I actually want to do going forward? And I think it's important to go beyond. There's a lot of sort of survey evidence which says, people say, yes, I like to be in the office 3 days a week, or I like to be 2 days a week. Yeah, that may be what we all say. What's it actually like in practice? I'd like to be in the office, let's say 3 days a week. I'd also quite like it if everybody else was in on the 3 days that suit me. And if they're not, then I begin to think, why have I come all this way to have a Zoom call with someone when I could have been at home, with my favorite coffee, having the same Zoom call? So I think that the serious point of that is this is an iterative process at best. I think there's going to be a lot of trying it out. Some things work, some things don't work. So I think the policy framework should be as flexible as possible with regard to that. That's not easy to do. If you like, at the other end of the pole, if it's pretty clear that London and Toronto and wherever are going to continue to grow in terms of people and jobs, for goodness sake, don't stop doing all the things that we're already doing. Don't hold up the transit investment while we sit and ponder it. Don't agonise about, is the city going to keep growing, because it's fairly clear it is. What is the fiscal take from that going to be? What kind of adaptations in the labour market are needed? What is the skills base looking ahead? All the sort of issues that we normally deal with. You need to keep going on that. And I feel, certainly in the UK, but possibly more generally, there's a little bit of everybody freezing because we don't know what's going to happen. If you don't keep the fundamental policy approaches going, then you're going to slow down the whole process. I'll leave it there because there's a whole load of other sub-issues we could pick up.
Okay, well, maybe we can zero in on the London CBD,
Yeah.
right, where there's such great concentration of workers, probably similar to Toronto, where 30% plus of all jobs in the city are located in the downtown.
Yeah.
Can and will it endure even if workers don't return at the same levels? And if so, how? And I know you touched on, like, you know, if we have remote work, have everyone come the same days, but will our downtowns endure in the way that we know them?
Yeah.
How might we expect them to change? And how does that affect the sort of the globalness, right?
Yes.
The global impressions
Yeah.
and status of these cities.
Yep. So one thing that's very true, if you look up in London and you look up in Toronto, one thing you see in both places, you see an awful lot of cranes. Okay? So none of that has gone away. And I've noticed this in Toronto, and I've also had one or two people give me some hard facts on that. If you travel into London like I do and come into King's Cross, as you look out of the right-hand side, you see an enormous building, which is going to be the Google HQ. Work has not stopped on that. And in fact, I think Google announced recently that their existing central London base, which they were going to quit, they've decided to stay there, and I think they're actually expanding the space there in addition. And you know, you can repeat this story for a number of different major investors. What seems to be happening in the property market is that prime property and prime location, it's still going in exactly the way it was going before. There is no problem with that. When you start looking at secondary property and secondary locations, there it's more problematic, with people thinking, do we really need this space? And you can see also from the behavioural point of view, which I touched on at the beginning, if I'm offered the chance to work in the Google building, I can only imagine how nice that is to work in, I'm probably going to come in. Do I want to come into a rather poor quality building in not a great location, which isn't a nice place to spend 7 or 8 hours? No. So you're going to see differential effects there. I think, you know, I believe generally space in the centre gets recycled to other uses. So if there's a fall off in some of the traditional demand or demand for traditional office space, it can be reused for other things. It might be reused for residential. My friends at the Centre for London produced a report last week looking at the scope for having more residential in central London. Incidentally, that has the spin-off that the sort of CBD donut effect you saw there, if people do have to live at home for a while, like if there's another pandemic, sorry to mention it, it's quite good to have a bigger residential population to keep the demand up in the central area. So some of it could go to resi, some of it could go to other uses. It might go to more startup and scale-up space. We've had a huge issue, I'm sure it's the same here, about creative space, with arts and cultural uses being squeezed out of the centre because rents and capital values are too high. If they fall, some of that might come back. Some secondary office locations outside London, in other words, where firms have said, we can't have everybody in the centre, it's too expensive, so we're going to move some of them further out to a secondary centre. Some of those decisions might get revisited. So you might see more of a problem, perhaps in some of the smaller towns further outside London, if there's a move back into the city, if asset values and rents fall. So I think there's going to be a lot of change, and change is always difficult. It's particularly difficult, I think, if you're a policy maker because you like things to stay the same. But from an economic point of view, change is generally good because it creates new opportunities, new investment, new innovation.
I think you make a really good point around, the only way that we can bring more residential uses into the downtowns, but also more creative uses, more, uses that aren't traditional core office spaces, requires a big if, which is, reduction in value of real estate, which we have not seen throughout the pandemic at all. I mean, I know in Toronto we see house prices skyrocketing, close to $2 million for a detached single-family home. We see our downtown core also with more cranes apparently than ever before, and a lot of plans, right? And you talked about Google, and we see the tech companies on the one hand saying, go ahead, work remote forever, and on the other hand, investing very large sums in high-priced, great location, great amenity office locations. So we have a bit of a disconnect there. Is it the same in London? And does some of it maybe suggest that, again, as we need to be thinking about change, that actually a lot of people are preparing for change that takes us back to much closer to where we were?
Yeah, I think you've got one big asset in Toronto, which I have to shout out to Matty on this because I didn't realise this. I mean, the scale of the Portlands, you've got a big chunk of land. You've got a huge chunk of land. You can increase the size of your CBD, but I don't know how many percent. And in London, to some extent, we've done that because that was the Docklands story. That was the Canary Wharf story. And to a lesser extent, it's the way in which some of these secondary locations have been included in the CBD. I mean, if I'm allowed one anecdote, I was talking to my wife and son a while ago about where we should meet for lunch, and we were weighing up whether to meet in Paddington or to meet in King's Cross, both of which are very nice urban areas. Now, 10 years ago, you'd have to be crazy to want to meet in either of those places. You would just walk through them as quickly as possible and get on your train. So they've been completely transformed. The Docklands is a huge area. You've got scope. I know you've got the lake. You can't build out over the lake, but you've got a lot of land around the lake. So in the long run, you've got the scope for having a bigger city. So I'd be wary about what happens to asset values in general, or at least you can increase the pipeline. I think the housing story is a different story, and this still slightly amazes me. Most cities, in London, house prices have continued to rise, but not at the level of Toronto, and generally in London, not at the same rate as the rest of the UK, although they're pretty high already. But there does seem to be something rather different going on here, whether that's because immigration numbers are still high and there isn't enough supply, or there's other features, but that seems to be potentially, a big weakness if there isn't some movement towards greater affordability in the city.
Well, and that actually takes us, a good segue to my next question, which is on inequalities, right? Here in Toronto, we have a tremendous housing affordability crisis. It's been exacerbated in large part by the pandemic, despite a lot of expectations. What are the most significant inequalities emerging in London? You mentioned unemployment, and you mentioned the sort of differential changes in spending patterns, increased use of food banks. And what kinds of similarities do you see with Toronto, especially now that you're here, or with other global cities that you've been studying?
Okay, so when I worked at City Hall, the story, the top line story was the city is growing, this is good, it's a jobs generator. The other side of that was too many of those jobs were low paid. And it felt, both in terms of jobs and in terms of skills, if you're a policymaker on this, it sometimes feels like you're trying to run up an escalator which is actually going down. So in other words, you have to run very fast just to stay in the same position. So there was an underlying issue about low skills. There's an underlying issue about too many low-paid jobs, partly because of the changing nature of the economy, but also because of the low-skilled space overall. So I think that was already there. It seems to have been exacerbated to some degree because of the pandemic. But the other thing that the pandemic has exposed is really this crossover. If you look just at the level of public health inequalities and your chance of catching the disease or becoming seriously ill from it, that overlay of living in overcrowded housing, being in a customer-facing job, which you can't do from home. Also in the UK, I don't know how true this was in Canada, another thing it exposed was we have by European standards, we have very low rates of replacement income if you are off sick, your sickness benefit. So we had a phenomenon there of people who tested positive and continued to go to work because they would say, I can't afford not to go to work because the amount of money I'm getting if I'm off work is just way too low. So it exposed weaknesses in the benefit system, which is not supporting the lower, whatever, quarter, third of the population. Also, and I haven't done any detailed work on this, I don't know if anybody has, but we did have a very successful furlough system of replacement income for people who couldn't go to work because their firms were closed. It's great. It's a great success story. Well done, the Treasury, for doing that. But why was it necessary? It was partly necessary because our out-of-work benefit system doesn't really support people to the level of income that they needed to keep going for many months. So in other words, great, the government was able to make a very positive and swift response, but that shouldn't stop us asking, why was that necessary on this scale, and how can we change the way we support incomes to make that better? So some of those are very familiar issues. Some of them, I think, from what I can see, are true in Toronto. Then you've got the whole thing of, particularly with housing affordability, are people going to just have to live further and further out? Are they going to commute back in? And then that brings you again into this, do people really need to be at work? And what are the downsides if people are spending a chunk of their time or perhaps most of their time working from home where they can?
Mm-hmm. Something that's very troubling here too in response to inequalities raised as a result of the pandemic is that you have a sense that there is a period of time in which you can address those because everything is different for the moment. And it seems that much of that has sort of, we've missed the boat on so much, right? We had these heroes working in grocery stores and we paid them $2 an hour more for a very short period of time, and then we said, yeah, you don't get that money anymore, and we didn't replace it with anything, and we haven't made anything better, right? It continues to go down, even though we can see so much more clearly, right, these inequalities and the difference in people who have to work in person versus those who have the privilege of remote work. And so I'm sort of asking, is there hope? Is there something happening in London or in the UK where a more permanent change was made? And
I'd like to say yes, but I don't think that would be true. I think it's a very similar pattern, and you worry as we come out. It's great to come out of the pandemic. Let's be clear, but are we going to forget all this? And I think one of the lessons I draw from that is, the structure matters and the policy matters. So we would have regular things where we would clap on a Thursday for health workers. I'm sure it was similar here. It's nice to do that, and it brought communities together. It would be even nicer if we didn't have to do that. If we didn't have to say thank you as a nurse for going in or a healthcare assistant because you're not paid very much but you're working very hard. It would be nicer if that wasn't necessary because they were being paid the right rate. You can still clap for them or congratulate them, but it shouldn't be a substitute. And I don't think that's going to happen unless we keep reminding policymakers and decision makers about the importance of this and actually continue to do the research on what the impacts have been and what we'll need to do better next time round to get ready. Because there will be, this will happen again. It may be a pandemic next time, or it may be something else. It may be a climate-related emergency, of some kind. But the city has to be more resilient, not just in a physical sense, but in the sense of if people's livelihoods and mobility are disrupted, do we have the right mechanisms in place to support people through that?
My very last question before we open it up to the audience is around these mechanisms.
Okay.
And I want to know if you can talk about how governments responded to challenges of COVID in London. And are there particular governance arrangements that enabled either the success or failure of these responses from an economic perspective, a health perspective, equity perspectives?
Yeah, and I think the pattern you see in the UK and in London, I think it's similar here, and it's similar in a lot of countries. So each level of government has a role. When you come to those big economic drivers, like in the UK, the furlough scheme to support people's incomes, the grants or cheap loans scheme to keep businesses running, it has to be the national or the federal government. There's no other agency that can do that. Then what's appropriate at a citywide level and what is appropriate at an ultra-local level? I'm not sure. I think there's some interesting things to look at there, because one thing that came through during the pandemic was the importance of very local neighbourhood information, which local government is best placed to. In other words, where are the vulnerable people in your particular neighbourhood? Which are the actual businesses that are entitled to government assistance, but perhaps they don't know about it for a variety of reasons. So it certainly made me begin to think a little bit about what is the appropriate division of responsibility at different levels, because you tend to think, I tend to think of the economic sphere should be a metro government or a citywide government. But when it comes down to making sure your neighbourhood businesses don't go under, that's maybe not the right level for getting the right kind of help to the right people as quickly as possible. So I think that's a bit new on the policy and research agenda, and it's worth looking at that, because as I say, there's going to be something else. Hopefully it won't be another pandemic, at least for a while, but there will be something else which will require this kind of real-time response, and we need to be better prepared for that one.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. I think if you have a question, please stand at the microphone so that we can hear you and so that all of the participants online can hear you. Thank you. I think so.
Could I take my...
For your question.
Thank you very much, Mark, for really very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Lots of questions. So I just want to follow up on the resilience system. So if you were to envision a resilient sort of future for global cities, what would be the kind of social and physical infrastructures and system are you thinking about? That both in sort of immediate and longer term future?
Okay, thank you, Ito. That's a big question. So I think there's something about neighbourhood structures, very ultra-local structures, which to a large extent in the UK either don't exist or exist in an attenuated form. So we had quite a lot, I'm sure it was the same here, quite a lot of volunteer groups which spring up, and that's great, to try and deal with those issues. But that partly indicates there's an absence of formal or more formal structures to deal with that. In the very quick run-through I did of the London and Paris thing, I think one of the most interesting points was that people were more positive about their local services. And I'd like to know more about that. Is it because they became more reliant on them? Is it because they didn't realise before how important they were? Or is it that their circumstances meant they became more dependent on that? But I think it points to, this is difficult in policy terms because you don't want to decentralise everything and have things run inefficiently entirely through neighbourhood or even smaller units. But it certainly suggests that there is maybe a bigger role for that than what we have at the moment. In terms of actual structures to do that, I don't know, to be honest. I haven't really got that far in the thinking. But I think there's certainly been a trend in the opposite direction for a long period of time. And I tie that a bit to what I said at the beginning, that we've got used to over 30 years. London's just going to continue to grow. Things are going to continue to be the way they were last year, but just more so. Maybe that's not going to happen in quite the same way. And thinking about delivery of services, what's important about a local area. I'm trying to avoid talking about a 15-minute city because I'm not sure we should have 15-minute cities, because some things you want to go across the other side of the city. But there's certainly something in that idea that when all our worlds shrank, we became more aware of what was important locally and also what was missing locally. So let's try and use that.
Thank you. Mike.
Thanks, Mark. Great to see you again, and
Good to see you, Mike.
great to hear your perspectives. I was wondering if you could draw on some of the knowledge in other places to sort of compare what's happened with London and Toronto with perhaps Paris or other cities, and whether you think the trends we're seeing in Toronto and in Paris are being repeated, or sorry, Toronto and London are being repeated in many other places in the world.
Okay. I don't think I know enough about how other cities have specifically responded. And in the little bit of work we've been doing on this, even just looking at London, Toronto, Sydney, you quickly become aware that the circumstances are quite different. I mean, this is partly, so if you take Canada, the UK, or if you take Toronto, London, Sydney, or Canada, UK, Australia, so immediately you've got, I think, a stronger public health response in Canada than in the UK, and a more data-led approach, I would say, although we had a lot of data, but I would say it's a little bit more data-led. When you look at Australia, of course, you have a very different policy framework to start with. So for a long time, they went for a zero COVID approach and were fairly successful in that zero COVID approach. So you have a very different set of responses. On the one hand, people could move around a lot more easily than they could in London or Toronto. On the other hand, Australia was cut off from the rest of the world, including sort of within families. Then you have a move away from the zero COVID approach to a set of policies which are more like perhaps the ones we've got used to. So, or we've got used to in our cities. So even just looking at three like that made me very aware of how important these underlying differences were, even where some of the policy instruments look very familiar. More broadly, I think, certainly if you look at Northern European economies, I'd want to look more at the welfare systems. I mean, the point I was making just now, if you want people to take public health seriously and say not go to work on not mix, you've got to make it easier for people to do that. So I think there'll be some important differences there. Also, again, I haven't researched it, but let's look at what's happening in Singapore, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, where you've had different approaches, but as we've seen now in Hong Kong, it looked like a completely different approach for a long period of time to stick with zero COVID, but then ultimately that didn't work, and you've got to transition to, again, policies more similar to this. So I think there's a rich variety across cities, and even where the terminology and some of the instruments look similar, in practice, they're not as similar as they look at first glance.
We have an online question now.
Okay.
Thank you. So my name's Thomas Hatchard. I'm the manager of programs and research at MFG, and I'm just going to ask you, Mark, a couple of questions we have from our online audience. So we had a couple of questions related to the governance decentralization conversation we were just having. One audience member was just remarking about how this could be an opportunity for municipalities to deliver more services even if they're funded by higher orders of government. But we had one question that also relates to this comparative approach you were just talking about here. We're just asking if in the research on pandemic in cities, is there any evidence of a link between the impact of COVID-19 and decentralization? Was the impact smaller or greater on cities and countries that have powers more devolved to subnational governments?
Okay, right. They're two really good questions, and they're related. I couldn't find a consistent pattern in the literature that I looked at, and I think this is I mean, if I get the time, I'd like to look at this more, but somebody should be looking at that. So you can construct a priori arguments in both directions, and I've seen commentary in both directions. In other words, you could say decentralized is good, people are closer to the ground, they know their own communities or their own cities, they need to be empowered to respond to that. The other argument is you need a national lead because it's a national crisis and you can have very different responses in different places. I haven't looked at it systematically. I've seen pieces of evidence, in both directions. I think it's a really important issue to look at, and it needs to be researched further. As I said earlier, I was struck by the fact that for the delivery of some of the very specific responses, you want to be at a local level, but within an overall public health framework, in terms of designing the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, you probably don't want too much differentiation across that. So there's that immediate, what's the right level, and does decentralization help or not? There's then a second issue, which is important, which is what is the current allocation of powers and funding, and is that the right one? So I think you have to look at the first one before you come on to the second, but you need to come on and look at the second one as well. I mean, a public health crisis, you are going to get centralization in the early stage. I don't see how you can't get that, because people are going to want to see their president, their prime minister, the leader of the province, whatever. They want a response at that level. But that doesn't mean that the response all the way through should be as centralized as that.
And I got one more from the online audience here. He asked, you started the talk on the impacts of COVID in London and Toronto from your perspective of working at King's College. What do you see as the role of urban anchor institutions, such as universities and medical institutions, in recovery and resilience in Toronto and London?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So, and it's very real for us because at King's, the work we do, and this has come from the top of the organisation as well, the work we do, we are thinking not just that we teach about this and we research it, but here we are right in the middle of London, like UFT is here. So King's, we have 5 campuses across central London. We have 7,500 employees. We have 33,000 students. And the same is true for UCL and the other, University College London and the other major institutions. So we are not just an observer, we are a participant in this. And obviously it's particularly acute, I'm sure it was the same here, because you've got a faculty and a student body that literally come from all over the world, which is what gives the university its richness and its dynamism, but it also means you have to take a special care under these circumstances. So what I'm hoping, I think there's been a little bit of a movement in the last few years of universities in London, or maybe in the UK generally, to see themselves as anchor institutions, to use the jargon a bit, or for me, to see themselves as economic actors and not as kind of invisible, weightless bodies, and taking seriously that economic role, whether it's to do with the pandemic and supporting people, but just generally in terms of what are the wages we pay, what are the conditions we expect people to work under. If we let people work from home, what about the people who have to come in? What about the cleaning and the catering and the security staff? How do we balance out those needs? What is the economic impact of the spend of our faculty and particularly our students on the local areas? What's our impact on housing affordability? So I think universities have been reluctant to think about this over most of their existence. I think it's been moving a bit in the right direction. Hopefully, this will give it a really good shove in the right direction.
I would have said nudge rather than shove.
Sorry, nudge. That's what I meant to say.
I think that's a fantastic question and a terrific answer. And thank you very much to everyone. I'm going to ask Enid now to come up and close.
Well, great. That was a fantastic presentation and a great discussion. The pandemic has certainly made us think about cities again and what cities are and what's going to happen to them. And I'm happy, Mark, to learn that cities will continue to exist, and the death of the city is definitely overstated. But cities will be different. I mean, it's pretty clear we're not going to go back to exactly where we were before the pandemic. You raised a number of interesting policy questions about health and the economy, inequality, transit, and I wanted to look back at the audience when you said, don't hold back on transit investment while you ponder it. That's something that really applies here to Toronto. We've also talked about how we've learned to do things better, particularly around issues of inequality. And it would be really nice if we can take that knowledge going forward and use it and not go back to where we were before. I liked your image of why are we clapping for people? We really should just pay them properly and give them good jobs and not be clapping for them as a substitute. And lastly, the whole issue, and it's really interesting to us at IMFG, around which level of government should be responsible for different things. And we are actually engaging now with the Urban Policy Lab here at the Monk School on a 2-year project on who does what, where we're looking at things like housing and policing and economic development and public health, and sort of saying, well, what is the role of cities, and where does the province come in, and where does the federal government come in? So these are issues that we are continuing to work on. So again, Mark, fantastic presentation. We love having you here. You must come back again.
Definitely.
Thank you, Shauna, for enriching the discussion with your questions and talking with Mark. And thank you, the audience online and here in person. Today's event has been recorded, and so it will be available on our website shortly. Please share it with your colleagues who couldn't attend today. And thank you so much for coming, and have a great evening.